Welcome to Thinkin, a podcast series by Kautilya School of Public Policy. Hello everyone, welcome to Thinkin, a podcast club of Kautilya School of Public Policy. Today we have with us a very wonderful guest, Mrs. Padma Priya, co-founder and editorial lead at Suno India, India's first podcast-only media startup. Ma'am, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much.
Ma'am, to begin with, the first question that we want to ask you is about what made you start a platform such as Suno India. You were an independent journalist before. How did you get into podcasting is what we want to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to give you the short answer and not tell you a long story.
Right.
I think me and my fellow co-founders, Rakesh Kamal and Tarun Nirvan, all three of us were in the development sector at that point in time. I was with Doctors Without Borders and so was Tarun, and my husband and the other co-founder, Rakesh Kamal, was working in the climate policy space. And what we realized was that the mainstream media was not covering a lot of important stories with the nuance that it deserves. So everything was being told either in a black or white. And these are stories that are not black or white. There's a lot of gray in between and lots of shades of gray. And I think we at that point decided that let's move away from this culture where anchors are screaming at each other and not really informing the public. Because see, the main role of a journalist is to inform the public and let them decide what they want to do with that information. You should not tell them how to think. So for us, we felt that podcast would be a good medium because of the intimate nature of the medium. And so that's how Suno India was conceptualized, and we went ahead and launched it 4 years ago. So I think it stemmed from the need to tell stories that we felt were not being told, in passing the mic to communities who want to tell their stories, and in sort of literally shining the spotlight on some of these very critical issues. So yeah.
Right. So ma'am, what do you think it looks like for the future looks like for the organizations such as Suno India, which are only on audio stories, right?
Yeah.
I felt for a very longest time that people are about more towards visual medium. The television, we've had a long experience with it.
Yeah.
So how are people perceiving audio only stories and platforms such as Suno India?
See, I don't want to think of it as audio versus video versus text versus YouTube. I mean, for me, like, these are all different ways of disseminating information. And for me, audio has its own set of audience. So I am somebody who will consume news from the newspaper. I will also read on my phone. I will also get it from Instagram, and I'll also listen to a podcast. So I think the way information is being consumed, not just news, information in general is being consumed has changed radically in the last 10 years. Right. And it has rapidly changed in the last 5 years. And I feel in India with more and more digital first, digital natives, as you call them, getting on to the internet, right? With that happening, I feel that there will be more and more exploration of different mediums and different modes of information. So somebody might download it for music, somebody may then discover podcasts, right? So somebody may download a JioSaavn for music, and then they will discover podcasts and they'll think, aha, ye kya hai? And then they will go on to listen to podcasts. So now you see, for example, this is a video podcast, right? So you will have different kinds of ways in which people will consume, and I think it's not this versus that. And in terms of the future of podcasting, I think it's looking good. I think it's looking nice. And what, like I was telling earlier to the other students, is that you should not think of language as a barrier. You should think of language as an advantage. And I think India is in a very advantaged position because we can do podcasts in so many languages, right? And you will be able to stand out. So you are not really competing necessarily only in the English language space with the US or UK. You are not. You have your own set of audience. You have your own set of audience who might want to listen to news in Bengali. Right. So make a Bengali news podcast, and then you will get listeners. So I think the future is bright for somebody who is very enterprising and who has the will to stay consistent. And I hope that we will be here for the next few years too. Of course,
yeah. Ma'am. So you're saying that it's positive, and more Indians are going to switch to podcasting.
Yeah.
Right? That's great. So while I was going through the Suno India website, the bio, and it was written that we set our own agenda and we are editorially independent. So in these times, I felt it was very refreshing to see that on that page. But as you said, more Indians are going to watch. There'll be, I don't know if you can call viewership for podcasts. Listenership, right.
Yeah.
As it increases, do you think there will be, there are going to be set of policies governing this area? Are there also, right now, are there any policies that are governing, and will it be difficult for organizations like Suno India, which
we already have, we are already coming under the new digital, new digital guidelines that was rolled out by the government for OTT and digital media startups, and we have our own self-regulatory body under which we fall under. So that is already happening, but like I was saying, that I think as long as the information you're putting out there is factual, is coming from the horse's mouth, so to say, right? So from the source itself, from your people on the ground, and you're able to back it up with facts, with data, with reports, with whatever is required. I think the kind of I think you should be able to we should be able to stand on our own 2 feet and continue to keep putting out good journalistic material out there. Will the pressures increase as the listenership increases? I think that will happen eventually, and when it happens, we'll see what to do about it then. Yeah.
So right now, I wanted to understand, who is Suno India catering to? Is it the urban elite, the rural, the vernacular? Who is it actually catering to?
Very good question. All our shows have its own audience, and that's what I was telling again. You should not be scared of creating niches, because in podcasting niches work. So for example, for our podcast on cyber governance, digital governance called cyber democracy, and digital rights and so on, it's called cyber democracy. It has its own set of audience, and we are not sorry, is that some?
We can go ahead. No problem.
Yeah. So that has its own set of audience. So I think, for us, right now, I would say we have 2 kinds of audience. One is obviously the ones who are coming from the metros, metro cities, but we also have people who are youngsters and who are wanting to know more about the world around them, and who are also coming from smaller towns and not necessarily only the metros, because we are also in different languages. We are currently in Hindi, Telugu and English, and hope to expand in the coming months or years. Yeah.
Right. And in the last decade that we have seen in the visual medium, especially with respect to YouTube, there's a whole load of content creators that have come through YouTube, bloggers, and they have monetized their model also. Again, I think thanks to YouTube and the whole model, the sponsors. Do you see this happening with podcasting in future? Will there be content creators who can monetize the podcasting?
Yeah, I think it will happen, and I think it's not too far away that marketing agencies will start adding podcasts as a way to sort of expand a certain brand's identity. So I think in fact they are missing out on really good opportunity, because podcasts are more longevity, say, than a radio jingle or a YouTube ad, for example, which will disappear. You have an option to skip ad in YouTube, but you don't have that in podcast. You can't skip an ad in podcast. So and the placement of it is really timely. So I think in the coming years, hopefully in the next 2-3 years, there will be ways to monetize this, but maybe it won't necessarily be in the scale of YouTube immediately, but I think it will happen.
Okay. And
like I said, I think it's very difficult to compare podcasts with, say, YouTube, because it's completely different medium, and we are talking about a technology, which is still using RSS feed and has not been updated in I don't know how many decades now. So, yeah.
Okay. So there are several news articles that talk about recent boom in the podcast listeners due to COVID. Do you agree with this, and how has your experience at Suno India been through the COVID?
Yeah, I think the initial 1 year we did see quite a big spike in our listenership, and I think it was because mainly people were working from home, and they had podcasts. In that sense, you can do passive listening. You can put it on there, and you can be doing other things. You can be working on your computer, you can be feeding your child, you can be reading a book or cooking in the kitchen. So podcast in that sense is very passive. So I think it did see a spike definitely in the first year, but of course there is always a fatigue with any sort of medium, and I think right now the fatigue has probably set in, for I think all kinds of information consumption. Now again people are going back out. People ultimately, we're human beings are social beings, right? We want to sit and chat like this. We don't want to be sitting and 24/7 watching OTT or listening to podcasts or reading a book. There's only so much you can do of that. So I do agree with that. There was a boom, and also there were a lot of creators who came out during the podcast, during the pandemic. But I think not all of them managed to survive the last 3 years. So yeah.
Currently, I see that on Suno India, there's this Telugu, Hindi, and English content. So, what other languages do you want to cater in the near future, and especially with respect to the regional language? How are they receiving it? How is the reception from the regional crowd?
I think the reception has been wonderful. I think our regional crowd is one which is very consistent, which keep coming back to our episodes, which are always hungry for more information. Our Telugu podcast does really well, so does our Hindi news podcast. And yeah, I mean, hopefully in the near future we can, diversify into other southern languages. I think that would be our first focus, southern languages, and then maybe other languages, if we can add on. But I think regional audiences, you are literally, especially in the journalism space, right? You're literally like an oasis in a desert,
Right.
So I think it's an opportunity, and it's a fantastic opportunity for people who want to get into podcasting, say in the current affairs space or the policy space. Because this is a policy school, I would suggest that if anyone wants to do a policy podcast in regional language, nothing like it. Start demystifying the policy behind, say, solar or something like that, and I think there will be takers for it.
That's great to know, and I think a lot of us will be interested in doing that, ma'am. Absolutely. And so one differentiating factor that I was just reading this in an article between the video and audio content is that the listener has a deep connection with the podcast host. Do you sort of agree with this?
Yeah, I think this is what came up. Like, we recently did an audience survey, and something that came up for us was that, we deeply connect with your host, so we want more spontaneous conversations, because we do a lot of reported narrative stories. So they were like, we also would like some, some conversation style sort of podcasts. So I completely agree with this. So, and I think it's really important to find a very good host for your podcast. For example, Beyond Charminar is hosted by Yunus Lasania, who is he's a oral story historian himself, and he writes a lot about Hyderabad's history. And he has a fantastic way of telling the, in his podcast. It's very Hyderabadi. It's very, and a lot of our listeners love his podcast, and that's because they also connect to him at a very intimate level. So it's really important to have the right kind of host for the podcast. So I feel like it's almost like we had a listener who told us when we were doing this audience survey. They said that, when we listen to you guys talking, it feels like we are in the same room and we're just sitting and listening to two people talking.
Wow.
So that's the sort of sense that people get when they're listening to a podcast.
Right, and you have a Telugu podcast which is very interesting, Kada Cheppava Amma or something.
Yeah, that's our Telugu storytelling podcast, and we have 2 storytelling podcasts, and this one, 3, one in Hindi and Telugu, and another one in Tamil, which is being done by another external host. Kada Cheppava Amma is basically a storytelling podcast for children, where we are telling children about the world around them in a very fun manner, right? So whether it's about what is the role of a butterfly, or what is the role of a squirrel, for example, how do you simplify it? How do you tell children about it? And it's honestly aimed at almost 4 to 8 year olds, and we have really good response for that podcast. Yeah.
So that's a very interesting title that I got hooked onto, and so I have seen shows on current affairs, history, and news on Suno India. If you have to define Suno India in one word, what would it be? Like, is it an informational platform, educational, entertainment, or how would you define
Infotainment, maybe.
Infotainment. Okay,
Yeah.
that's a great way to put it, ma'am. So one last question before we leave you, ma'am. We wanted to know your favorite podcast, an Indian podcast show,
Oh
and
my-
why.
Oh my God. I only listen to like so much of Suno India content that my brain will only come up with Suno India podcast. But no, I mean, all jokes apart, I think within Indian podcasts, I do like, I forget the name now. I'm sorry, I'm completely blanking out on the name. But some of the podcasts that Vaka Media has put out,
Okay.
I really like them. City of Women, I mean, it's a good podcast. Seen Unseen by Amit Verma is another
Of course.
fab podcast, of course. And yeah, I mean, these are some of the things I can think. But from the international side, I think Radio Lab remains like my favorite. I love
Okay.
Radio Lab. Planet Money is another favorite of mine. So yeah.
Great, ma'am. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure
Yeah.
talking to you. Thank you so much for joining
Thank you.
us.
Thank you so much
Thanks
for
a
having
lot.
me. Yeah.